The boy hid the bloodied handkerchief under his pillow before the governess turned around. Grace Pemberton was 23, the new governess at Wendover Hall in Devonshire, and her wages had not been paid in 4 months. She wore the same string-colored gown every day, mended at the cuffs, and a marble brooch at her throat that had belonged to her mother. The east wing of the great estate had been sealed by order of the steward, Silas Fenwick, and the windows nailed shut against the spring air. Young Master Theodore Harcourt, 8 years old and heir to the dukedom, coughed into linen and stained it red, and pretended he had not. Grace pried open the nailed window with her own hands. It was the first order she had ever broken. 3 nights later, on the servants' stair, she came upon a man soaked through with rain and blood. His black coat was torn at the shoulder, pierced clean through by a pistol ball. He pressed the ruined garment into her arms without explanation. "You saw no one," he said. He was Caspar Harcourt, Duke of Wendover, master of the house, and she had never before laid eyes on him. She did not give him up. She carried the coat to the sewing room and, by candlelight, began to wash the blood from the wool. But what she found behind the wall of that sewing room. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. Devonshire, March of 1817. Wendover Hall stood at the end of a beech avenue gone to ruin, its east wing shuttered for 3 winters and its chimneys cold. Inside the nursery on the 2nd floor, Grace Pemberton drew a needle through the seam of a small woolen robe and did not lift her eyes when the boy on the bed coughed again. The cough was the small dry one. She had learned its difference from the wet one a fortnight ago. "Read another," Theo said. His voice was a thread. Grace turned the page of the Latin primer balanced on her knee and read 4 lines of Cicero in the slow, even cadence she used for fever nights. She kept the rhythm of her stitching unbroken. The robe was the navy one with the silk cord, mended at the cuff so many times the cuff was more thread than wool. She had taken the boy's white linen handkerchief from beneath his pillow that morning. She had washed it in cold water in the basin behind the curtain. The brown stain in the corner had not gone out. Theo had hidden the handkerchief from her. He had hidden it from his father longer. Grace. Yes. Don't tell Papa about the lozenges. She set the primer down. Which lozenges? The ones Mr. Fenwick said cost too much. A coal shifted in the grate. The fire was small because the coal was rationed. Grace counted to 3 in her mind, in Latin, which was a habit she had not lost from the rectory schoolroom. Then she resumed the stitch. "I shall not tell your papa about the lozenges," she said. "I shall speak to Mr. Fenwick myself. He doesn't listen to governesses. He shall listen tonight." A floorboard creaked beyond the door, and Mrs. Aldous came in with the chatelaine of keys ringing softly at her hip. The housekeeper was a tall woman with a bony face and a toque of white linen, and she carried a brass candle holder in one hand and a folded sheet of paper in the other. She closed the door behind her with her elbow and crossed to the bed before she spoke. "Master Theodore, are you warm enough?" "Yes, Mrs. Aldous. Drink the barley water." He drank. The housekeeper waited until the cup was empty. Then she looked at Grace and tipped her head once toward the corridor. Grace knotted her thread and laid the robe across the foot of the bed. "I shall be back before the candle is half down," she told the boy. "Mind you do not let it gutter." "I shall not." In the corridor the air was colder by several degrees. Mrs. Aldous walked 3 paces ahead and did not turn until they reached the recess by the linen press, where no draught carried sound. She held out the folded paper. "From Mr. Fenwick's office. Pinned to the housekeeping board this afternoon." Grace took it. The hand was small, slanted, and economical. "Quarter wages for the upper servants suspended until Lady Day next, on account of estate retrenchment. Signed, Silas Fenwick, steward of Wendover." There was no seal. "Quarter wages," Grace said. "Suspended." On whose authority? His own. Grace folded the paper once, then again. She did not crumple it. She slid it into the pocket of her apron beside the broken end of a sewing needle she had been meaning to throw into the kitchen fire. "His Grace has not signed this. His Grace has not been seen in the corridor of business since Michaelmas. You know it as well as I do. And the under housemaids. He has dismissed 2. He says the household consumes too much soap." The brass candle holder trembled by half an inch in Mrs. Aldous's hand, and then was still. The housekeeper had been 40 years in service and was not given to trembling. Grace looked once at the candle and once at the woman's bony face, and understood what was being told her without being said. "How much is owed to you, Mrs. Aldous?" £11, since Christmas. "And to cook?" "9. And to me, £6 4 shillings. The 2 new gowns for Master Theodore came out of your last quarter, as you asked them to." They did. Yes. The 2 women stood in the recess and did not speak for the time it took a moth to circle the candle twice. Beyond the linen press, the corridor ran east, and at the end of the corridor was the door that gave on to the east wing. The door was nailed shut on Mr. Fenwick's orders. The east wing held the late Duchess's morning room, in which there was a southern window of clear glass that took the afternoon sun. The boy had not seen the afternoon sun on his face since November. Mrs. Aldous. "Madam, the east wing, nailed 3 years next Michaelmas." "By whose authority?" "His Grace, when grief was on him. Mr. Fenwick has kept the nails in. The morning room window faces south." "It does." Grace took the candle holder from the housekeeper's hand and held it herself so that the light fell forward and not on her face. "Mrs. Aldous, has any physician examined Master Theodore this 12-month? Mr. Fenwick has refused the bill." "Refused which bill?" "All of them. He says the boy will not last the year and the expense is a waste against the entail." Quote, the candle did not gutter. Grace's hand did not tremble. Something in her chest, however, made a small adjustment that she felt as a heat behind the breastbone, and she understood that what had happened in that moment could not be undone. "Where is the claw hammer?" Mrs. Aldous looked at her for a long instant. "In the carpenter's cupboard by the back stair." "Fetch it. Bring also a cloth for the noise. We shall not wake the child. Madam, if Mr. Fenwick learns—" "Mr. Fenwick will learn. I shall tell him myself in the morning. He will dismiss you. He has already not paid me." The housekeeper did not move for the space of a breath. Then she did move, and was gone down the back stair with the swiftness of a woman half her age. Grace stood alone in the recess with the candle and tried to feel something other than the small heat behind her breastbone, and could not. She had been governess at Wendover Hall for 14 months. In that time, she had not once disobeyed a written order from the steward. The paper in her apron pocket weighed less than a sewing needle and more than every order before it. She went back along the corridor with the candle low. At the nursery door, she paused and listened. Theo was breathing the slow, shallow breath of half-sleep. She did not go in. She went on to the end of the corridor and stood before the nailed door of the east wing. The door was oak, banded with iron at the hinges, and 4 iron nails had been driven through the jamb into the door itself at the height of a man's hand. The nail heads were rusted. A length of cord had been tied across the latch and sealed with a blob of black wax bearing the steward's mark, a thin S above a thinner F. Grace held the candle close to the wax and read the mark with the same steadiness with which she had read the Latin to the boy. Mrs. Aldous returned with the hammer wrapped in a kitchen cloth and a second cloth folded for the door. She held them out without speaking. "The wax first," Grace said. The housekeeper broke the wax with a thumbnail. The cord fell to the floor in 2 pieces. Grace set the candle on the linen press shelf and took the hammer in her right hand and the folded cloth in her left. She pressed the cloth flat against the first nailhead to muffle the strike, fitted the claw, and drew. The wood gave with a small sigh. She caught the nail in the cloth before it could ring against the floorboards. The second nail, the third, the fourth. The latch turned beneath her hand as though it had been waiting. The door opened a finger's width and then a hand's width, and a draught of cold air came out of the east wing carrying the smell of dust and old beeswax and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender that had been put up in a press and forgotten. Grace took up the candle again and stepped over the threshold. The corridor of the east wing was the same corridor as the west, only emptier. The portraits had been turned to the wall. The runner had been rolled and stood on end against the wainscot. Her footsteps were the first to mark the dust in 3 winters, and they marked it cleanly, a single line of small prints from threshold to morning-room door. The morning-room door was not nailed. It opened on a hinge that complained once and then was quiet. The window was where she had remembered it from the housekeeper's account, tall and southerly, the panes filmed with gray but unbroken. The shutters had been folded across the inside and barred with a wooden batten. Grace set the candle on the writing table by the wall, lifted the batten free, and folded the shutters back into their boxings one by one. The bar was heavy. Her arm ached from holding the hammer. She set her shoulder to the work and did not pause. The last shutter folded back. The moon was up. A square of cold blue light fell across the dust on the floor in the exact shape of the window and reached as far as the leg of the writing table. It was the first light, other than candle or hearth, that the room had received in 3 years. Grace stood in the square of moonlight and breathed once, slowly, and the heat behind her breastbone became something quieter and more dangerous. She heard Mrs. Aldous in the doorway behind her. "Madam." "In the morning," Grace said, without turning, "before Mr. Fenwick has taken his tea, we shall carry Master Theodore down here in his chair. He shall have the sun on his face for an hour, and when Mr. Fenwick learns, he shall find the door open, and the boy in the chair. He shall not nail the door a second time with the child in the room. Madam, the wages. I know. He will say the soap. He will say a great deal. Let him." Mrs. Aldous took one step into the room and stopped at the edge of the moonlight as though she did not quite dare to cross it. She looked at the square of blue on the dusty boards, and then at Grace, and her bony face did something it had not done in 14 months. It softened. "There were oranges once," she said. "In that bowl on the writing table, her Grace kept them through Lent, were there, in a blue Wedgwood bowl. We shall find a bowl." The housekeeper nodded once and went out. Grace stood another moment in the moonlight. Then she closed the shutters again, but did not bar them. She folded the batten neatly against the wall. She took up the candle and the hammer and the 4 nails wrapped in the cloth, and she went back across the threshold of the east wing and drew the door shut behind her. She did not refasten the cord. She did not melt new wax over the latch. The steward's seal lay broken on the floorboards in 2 pieces, and she stepped over it. In the corridor, she put the nails in her apron pocket beside the folded paper. At the nursery door, she paused to compose her face. The boy was awake. He had let the candle burn lower than he had promised, and his cheeks were flushed in 2 small spots, and his eyes were too bright. "Where did you go?" "To open a window." "Which window?" "Your mother's." He was quiet. He looked at her for a long time with his father's gray steel eyes in a face too small for them, and then he said, "Will you read more Cicero?" "Yes." "The part about friendship?" "Yes." She drew the chair close to the bed, settled the navy robe across his shoulders, and opened the primer to the Laelius. She read in the same even cadence she had used before. Her hand had stopped trembling some minutes ago. The needle had been laid aside. The mending could wait until morning. She read for a quarter of an hour. The boy slept before she reached the end of the chapter. She marked the page with a length of black ribbon and closed the book. She watched him breathe. The shallow rhythm steadied as he sank deeper, and at some point near midnight, the rhythm changed from sleep to something nearer to rest, and she let herself believe, for the length of one breath, that the cough had not yet won. She did not allow herself a second breath of believing. There was the matter of the wages, there was the matter of the steward, there was the matter of the 4 nails in her apron, and the broken seal on the boards of the east wing corridor, and the bill of physicians that had been refused. And underneath all of those there was the older, colder matter that she did not yet have words for. A child of 8 was hiding blood in his handkerchief because he had learned that to cough in the steward's hearing was to cost the house money. A duke who had not signed his name to a household paper since Michaelmas was somewhere in his own walls and did not know what was being done in them. Grace tucked the broken end of the sewing needle out of her apron pocket and dropped it into the small brass dish on the writing table by the nursery hearth. It made a small, clean sound, like a coin set down on a counter at the close of a bargain. She took up the navy robe and the needle and the thread and resumed her stitching by the low fire. The brooch of ivory at her throat, her mother's, caught the candlelight once when she leaned forward. She stitched until the cuff was whole again. Then she stitched the lining of the sleeve, which was not torn, only thin, because thin cloth was easier to tear, and she did not intend that this robe should tear again before summer. When the candle had burned down to a stub, she rose and crossed to the window of the nursery and stood with her hand on the latch. The window was not nailed. She lifted the latch and pushed the casement open the width of a hand. Cold air came in, carrying the smell of wet beech leaves and wood smoke from the home farm. She breathed it once, deliberately, the way she had breathed the air of the morning room, and she let the boy have the rest of it in his sleep. 3 windows in 3 hours. The first had been a handkerchief. The second had been a door. The third was a casement that no one had told her to keep shut, but which she had been in the habit of keeping shut all the same, because a governess does not open windows in a sick room at midnight in March. She left it open. Behind her on the bed, Theo turned in his sleep and murmured something that might have been Latin and might have been his mother's name. Grace did not turn to listen. She stood at the open window and looked east along the dark line of the avenue toward the gatehouse. where a single lantern burned at the porter's lodge and would burn until dawn. Somewhere beyond the lantern, on a road she could not see, a man on a black horse was riding toward Wendover, with a pistol ball lodged under the bone of his left shoulder and the rain beginning to set in. She did not know it. She would not know it for 3 nights. But the window she had just opened was the window through which, 3 nights hence, she would hear the kitchen yard gate strike its post at the wrong hour, and she would take up a candle, and she would go down the back stair to see. She closed the casement at last, but only halfway. She latched it on the loose notch. Then she went back to the chair by the bed and took up the primer and did not open it. She sat with the closed book in her lap and watched the boy sleep, and the 4 iron nails in her apron pocket were warm against her thigh from the heat of her own body, as though they had been drawn not from a door, but from a wound. In the morning she would speak to Silas Fenwick about the wages. In the morning she would carry the boy down to the morning room and set him in the square of Southern Light. In the morning also, the steward would find his seal broken on the floor of the East Wing corridor and would understand that the governess had moved from obedience to something else, and he would begin, in the careful slanted hand of his small letters, to draft the first of the documents by which he meant to be rid of her. She did not yet know his hand. She would learn it. The candle guttered. She did not light another. She sat in the dark beside the sleeping child, and she waited for the dawn, the way a soldier waits for an order he has already decided to disobey. 3 nights after the rain, the wind off the moor came in low and steady, finding every loose pane in the east wing. Grace did not sleep through it. She had not, in truth, slept at all. She lay listening to Theo's breath 2 rooms away, counting the small wet rattle at the end of each exhale, and when the long case clock on the landing struck 2, she rose without lighting a candle. She knew the corridor by touch now. 6 paces to the doorframe, 12 more to the turn, then the cold patch of stone where the runner had been rolled up and never put back. Fenwick had ordered the carpets lifted in October. He had said the moths were in them. The moths had not been in them. The runners had gone to a buyer in Exeter, and the money had not gone to the household. She carried the empty pewter jug down to fetch fresh water from the scullery pump, because Mrs. Aldous would not let a boy with blood on his handkerchief drink from a covered jug that had stood since supper. It was a small refusal. It was the size of refusal Grace could afford. The servants' stair was narrow and uncarpeted, the treads worn into shallow cups by 2 centuries of feet. She went down them barefoot, slippers in her free hand, the way she had been taught at 12, so that no creak would carry. The pump room lay at the bottom, beyond the still room, beyond the cold larder that smelled of brine and old apples. She was on the 3rd tread from the bottom when she heard the door. It was not the kitchen door. Those hinges sang. This was the side door under the chapel buttress, the one Fenwick had ordered nailed shut in November. She had passed it that very afternoon and seen the iron nails sunk flush in the oak. The door opened anyway. Then it closed, very quietly, against the wind. Grace did not move. She stood with the jug in her right hand and her slippers in her left, and she listened. A man's tread, slow, uneven, the drag of one boot as if the leg behind it were not entirely his own. Water dripping. A great deal of water dripping, on the slate of the corridor, in a rhythm that meant cloth heavy enough to ring. She told herself it was a poacher. A poacher would turn left, into the kitchen, looking for bread. A poacher would not climb the servants' stair toward the family rooms. The tread came to the foot of the stair and started up. She had perhaps 4 seconds to decide. To run up before him would be to lead him to Theo. To go down past him would be to meet him in the dark. She stepped, instead, sideways, into the angle where the stair turned, where a man coming up would not see her until he was level with her shoulder. He came around the turn and he stopped, because the jug in her hand caught what little moonlight reached the stairwell and gave her away. For one breath neither of them spoke. He was tall. Even 1 step below her he was tall, and the breadth of him filled the narrow stair so that she could feel the cold coming off him in a wall. His hair was black and plastered flat to his skull with rain. His face was bone-white in the dim, save for a dark wet line down the left side of his jaw that was not rain. His coat had been a fine coat. It had been a gentleman's coat of black superfine wool with silk-faced lapels, the sort of coat she had only ever seen in the locked portraits in the long gallery. It was no longer fine. The left shoulder was torn open in a ragged round mouth the size of a child's fist, and the wool around the mouth was sodden black, and the black was not only water. His right hand was inside his coat, pressed hard against the place under the tier. His left hand hung at his side, and in it was a pistol, the brass of the lock dulled with wet. His eyes found hers. Gray eyes. Gray as the wash-water in the scullery basin at the end of a long Monday, and just as steady. He looked at her the way a man looks at a door he is deciding whether to break. Then he lowered the pistol. "You will give me," he said, "the use of your stare." His voice was lower than she had expected, and very quiet, and entirely without question. It was the voice of a man who had not, in his life, been refused a stare. Grace did not curtsy. She could not have explained, afterwards, why she did not curtsy. She had curtsied to the baker's boy that morning out of long habit. She did not curtsy now. She stepped down one tread, so that she was between him and the family floor above. "You are bleeding, sir," she said. "I am aware. On the stones." He glanced down. A small dark coin of blood had gathered at the toe of his right boot and was widening. He looked at it as if it belonged to another man. "Move," he said. "No." The word came out of her before she had given it leave. She heard it after he did. His head tilted, half an inch, as a hawk's head tilts when a small thing in the grass does the wrong thing. "No," she said again, more steadily. "There is a child sleeping on that floor, and he coughs blood at night, and I will not have a strange man with a pistol walk past his door. The library is on the gallery side. Take the great stair, it is empty. The great stair is watched." "By whom?" He did not answer. He did not need to. She saw the answer move across his face the way a cloud crosses a field, and she understood, all at once, with a clarity that did not feel like thought, that the man on her stair was not a stranger, and was not a poacher, and had not come in by mistake. She had never seen him. She had been in the house 7 months, and she had never seen him, but the boy on the floor above had gray eyes, the precise shade of these gray eyes, and there was only one man in the kingdom whose blood that could be. She set the jug down on the tread beside her foot, very carefully, so that it would not ring. "Your Grace," she said. He did not flinch. He had been expecting it, perhaps, from the moment she did not curtsy, but something at the corner of his mouth moved that was not quite a smile, and not quite tiredness. "You will not say that name in this house tonight," he said. "Not to your housekeeper, not to your priest. Not in your prayers. You will not have seen anyone on this stair. Do you understand me?" "Yes, say it. I did not see anyone on the stair." He looked at her then for longer than was civil, and she felt the look the way one feels a hand laid flat against a window from the other side. He was weighing her. He was weighing her against the cost of leaving her alive with the knowledge, and she felt, with a steadiness that surprised her, that he would decide in her favor, and that he would decide so for reasons that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with the arithmetic of a man who had been counting enemies for a long time and could not afford to add a maid to the list. He shifted his weight off the wounded leg, and a small sound escaped him that he would not have permitted himself in daylight. "You will need linen," she said. "I will need the back stair to my own dressing room, and I will need you to forget my face. You will bleed out on the runner before you reach it, sir." He looked at her again. The gray eyes were beginning to glaze at the edges, the way a pond glazes at the edges before the center. "Hold this," he said. He gave her the pistol. He gave it grip first, the way a man hands a tool to another man, and she took it because she did not know what else to do with her hand. It was heavier than she had imagined a pistol would be. The barrel was warm at the muzzle. It had been fired, and not long ago. Then he reached up with his free hand and unfastened the single sodden button at his throat, and he peeled the greatcoat off his shoulders with the slow care of a man undressing a wound, and he held it out to her. "Burn it," he said. She did not take it. "Burn it," he said again, "or bury it. I do not care which. It is not to be in this house at sunrise. Sir, this is— I know what it is. Burn it." She took it. She took it because the alternative was to let it fall on the stone, and let the blood of the Duke of Wendover make a map on the floor of his own servant's stair, for Fenwick's footman to find at 5. It weighed more than the jug. It weighed more than anything she had carried in 7 months. The wool was so heavy with water and with him that her arm dipped and she had to brace it against her hip. The lining was silk, gray silk. Her thumb went into the tear at the shoulder by accident and came out warm, and she did not look at her thumb. He took the pistol back from her. "Your name?" "Grace, sir. Grace Pemberton, the boy's governess." Something happened to his face when she said the boy's. It was very small. It was the smallest movement she had ever seen a face make, and still call it a movement. The mouth did not change. The eyes did not change. But the bone under the right cheek went quiet in a way it had not been quiet a moment before, as if a muscle there had been holding something for a long time and was, for one breath, allowed to set it down. "How long has he been coughing blood, Miss Pemberton?" "Since Candlemas, sir. He hides the cloths. In the bed warmer." "Yes." He nodded once. He had known. He had known and he had not been told. And she understood. Then, the shape of the war that was being fought over her head, and the side of it she had unknowingly chosen the night she opened the sealed window. "You will not speak of the cloths either," he said. "No, sir. Go up. Take your jug. Make him drink. Sit with him until the bell." "Yes, sir." He turned with great care on the narrow tread, and he began to go down, not up, down, back the way he had come, toward the nailed side door under the chapel buttress that had opened anyway. He went one step and then he stopped, and he did not turn his head. "Miss Pemberton, sir, you did not see anyone?" "No, sir. Good night." He went down into the dark, and the wet sound of him went with him, and the side door under the buttress opened once more, and closed once more, and the wind off the moor took the small noise of it, and folded it into the larger noise of itself, and she was alone on the stair with a pewter jug at her foot, and a soldier's pistol-warm coat across her arm, and a thumbprint of another man's blood drying on the pad of her thumb. She did not move for a long time. Then she picked up the jug. She went down, not up, 3 more treads, into the still room, and in the dark she found the great copper of cold rinsing water that Mrs. Aldous kept for the breakfast crockery, and she pushed the coat down into it until the wool drank and the water went pink and then dark, and she weighted it with the flat iron from the shelf so it would not float. She would deal with it before 5. She had between now and the kitchen fire being lit to make it disappear, and she had already begun, in the part of her mind that managed laundry and accounts and the slow ruin of a great house, to plan the soaking, and the cold rinse, and the lie, and the second rinse, and the place behind the linen press where a folded thing could lie for weeks if a person had a key. She washed her thumb in the same water. The water did not notice. She climbed the servant's stair with the jug full and her slippers still in her left hand, and she did not let herself shake until she was through the door of the schoolroom, and the door was shut behind her. Then she stood with her back against it, and she shook once, hard, from the knees up. One shake. She would not be granted another. Theo was awake. He was sitting up against the bolster with the bed warmer across his lap, and the corner of a fresh handkerchief pressed to his lower lip, and his gray eyes, those exact eyes, she could not unsee them now, were on her face. "Miss Pemberton, Master Theo, you should be sleeping. There was a noise on the stair. It was the wind. It is a great wind tonight." It was not the wind. She crossed to the bed and set the jug on the nightstand and poured the water with a hand that did not shake, because she had decided, on the threshold, that it would not. "Drink, please." He drank. He watched her over the rim of the cup. He drank like a child who had been listening at doors his whole short life, and had learned that the only way to be told anything was to let the grown people believe you had not heard. "Is my father come home, Miss Pemberton?" She had not been ready for the question. She did not look away from him, because to look away would be to answer. "Your father is in London, Master Theo, on the King's business, as you know. Mr. Fenwick said this morning that my father will not come home before the funeral." "Whose funeral?" "Mine." She took the cup from him. She set it down. She did not trust the cup in her hand for a moment longer. "Master Theo," she said, and her voice was the voice she used for declensions and for the names of the Roman emperors, and it was perfectly even. "You will not die before Christmas. You will not die in the summer. You will not die at all by Mr. Fenwick's calendar, because Mr. Fenwick does not keep yours. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Miss Pemberton. Lie down." He lay down. She tucked the bolster behind his shoulders so that his chest was raised, the way the old Edinburgh book had said, and she sat in the rush chair by the bed, and she took up the mending she had left at midnight, and she set the first stitch. Her hand was steady. Her hand had always been steady. It was the thing about herself she had relied upon for 23 years. She thought of the coat and the copper. She thought of the door under the buttress that had been nailed shut and had opened anyway, which meant that the nails had been drawn from the inside, which meant that the man who had drawn them was a servant of this house, which meant that there was a second man in livery in these halls who knew tonight what she now knew, and that man was not Mrs. Aldous, and not the boy in the boot room, and not the cook. She thought of the pistol, warm at the muzzle. She thought of the small, quiet movement under the Duke's cheekbone when she had said the boys. She set another stitch. She set another. The needle went in and came out, and the small, dry sound of it filled the room, and Theo's breathing slowed beside her, and somewhere below her in the dark a copper of pink water sat with a flat iron in it, and somewhere above her on the gallery floor a wounded man was climbing his own great stair alone, leaving no map. When the first gray came at the window, she rose without waking the child, and she went down again, and she lifted the coat from the copper, and she carried it wrapped in her apron through the back passage to the disused still room at the end of the laundry corridor, the one with the broken latch that Fenwick had never thought worth mending, because nothing of value was kept there, and she laid it flat on the slate slab where the dairymaid used to set the cheeses, and she covered it with the heavy bolt of unbleached Holland that had been waiting on that slab since Michaelmas, for a use no one had assigned it. She locked the still room with the key she had not been given, and had taken anyway, on the day Mrs. Aldous' chatelaine had been left on the kitchen dresser for the space of a kettle's boil. She put the key in the lining of her stays, against the bone. She went up to wake Theo for the morning prayers as if nothing had happened in the house that night, and as she crossed the gallery she heard, very faintly, from the far end of the west wing where the family rooms were sealed and were not sealed, a single floorboard give under a heavy, careful tread, and she did not turn her head. She had become, in the space of 1 hour and 1 stare, the keeper of a secret that could hang a duke or save him, and she did not yet know which, and the not knowing settled into her chest beside the broken stays and the bone-cold key, and stayed. The candle had burned down to a stub by the time Grace carried the coat into the sewing room above the scullery, and laid it across the deal table like a body brought in from a road. She closed the door. She slid the bolt. The bolt was new only in the sense that no one but she had thought to use it in 3 years. The wool was still damp at the shoulder. The blood had set into a brown crust the shape of a sycamore leaf, and beneath it, the lining had parted along a clean exit her own father, a saddler in his time, would have called the work of a ball, traveling fast and turning as it went. She set water to warm on the small grate. She fetched salt. She fetched the soft brown soap Mrs. Aldous kept for collars, and a basin of milk gone barely sour, because her mother had once shown her that fresh blood lifted with cold water, and old blood lifted with milk and patience. She did not think the word treason. She did not think the word duke. She thought only the word stitch, and then the word stitch again, because a mind kept on one word at a time cannot be made to tremble. By the second hour the brown leaf had paled to the color of weak tea. By the third it was a shadow only she would know to look for. She laid the coat flat to dry between 2 linen cloths and went down to her bed at 4 and slept as the dead sleep. She woke at 6 and rang no bell. For 3 nights she did not touch it. She tended Theo. She read him the catechism in the morning and Caesar in the afternoon, because the boy had asked, in a voice that did not waste breath, whether the Romans had been afraid of dying, and she had answered that the brave ones wrote it down so as not to be. She watched Fenwick come and go across the gravel court with his red ledger under his arm, and the silver watch chain glinting across the moss-green velvet, and she lowered her eyes as a governess lowers her eyes, and inside her chest, the bolt of the sewing room stayed shut. On the 4th night she went back up. The hole through the shoulder was the size of her smallest fingernail. The wool around it had frayed in a star, the way wool frays when a thing has passed through it at speed. She trimmed the star with her sharpest scissors. She cut a square from the inner skirt of the coat, where no eye would ever look, matched the weave thread for thread, and began the invisible mend her grandmother had taught her on altar cloth, the kind that cannot be felt with a thumb in the dark. She worked with the needle held close to the candle. Her shoulders ached, her eyes watered. She did not stop. It was on the 5th night, reaching for a spool that had rolled, that her knee struck the wainscot beside the chimney, and a sliver of light answered her from the wall. She held her breath. She set the candle down and pressed her cheek to the plaster. A crack, no wider than a knife blade, ran the height of 2 hands beside the brick of the flue. Through it came a thin gold line that was not her candle. Through it came, very faintly, the sound of a pen. She knew, without needing to be told, what lay on the other side. The sewing room shared its chimney with the library of the master of the house. The flue had shifted. Perhaps in the winter the great elm came down, perhaps long before, and someone had papered over the crack on the library side with a panel of damask that no longer sat flush. A pen scratched. A page turned. A man cleared his throat, the way a man clears his throat when he has been silent for a long time and means to dictate. To Mr. Ezra Hollingsworth, of Hollingsworth and Pyle, Lincoln's Inn. She did not move. Sir, the accounts of the Wendover estate for the years 1813 to the present have, by reason of my late absence and the irregular health of my heir, been kept out of my own hand. I have cause now to doubt their honesty. I require an auditor of your choosing, a man not known in this county, to arrive at the home farm under the pretext of buying timber, and to examine, in my private presence and no others, the rent books, the household ledger, and the receipts of the Bristol agent. Discretion is the whole of the commission. My signature follows. A pause. The pen again. Caspar Augustus Harcourt, Duke of Wendover. Grace closed her eyes. The name went through her like the cold of the stare. So he was alive. So he was here. So the man she had passed at 4 a.m. with rain in his hair and a hole in his shoulder had walked into his own library and sat down at his own desk and was, at this hour, while she breathed against a crack in a wall, writing the first sentence of a war. She did not move from the wall. He dictated a second letter, slower, to a magistrate at Exeter whom he addressed as cousin, asking only that the man hold himself ready to ride at a half-day's notice, and to bring with him 2 constables who could be trusted to remember nothing they were not asked to remember. He dictated a third to a physician in London concerning the lungs of a child of 8, the symptoms set down with a precision that made her throat close, and the request that the physician travel under the name of a portrait painter, since the household believed it was a portrait that had been ordered. He did not raise his voice once. He did not curse. He did not, in the hour she stood there, name Silas Fenwick. He did not have to. When the candle on the other side was snuffed, she stayed a long minute more in the dark, her cheek against the cold plaster, the smell of soot and old paper in her nose, before she lifted her own light and crept back to the table and the coat. She took up the needle. She put it down. She took it up again, and this time her hand was steady, and she understood with a quiet she had not felt since her mother died that she was no longer mending a stranger's coat. She was sewing for the only other person in this house who had decided, at the same hour as she, that the lying must stop. The thought did not flatter her. It frightened her. A governess who keeps a secret for a master keeps a small thing. A governess who keeps a secret with a master keeps a thing that will, sooner or later, ask her to choose. She finished the lining at 2:30 and began the outer star at 3. By the end of the first week of April, the coat hung inside the cupboard of the sewing room on a wooden peg she had wrapped in flannel, so the shoulder would keep its shape, and the crack in the wall had become a piece of her schedule, like the morning prayers, like Theo's beef tea. She went up at 10:30 when the house was settling, and at 5 before midnight when the library lamp was lit, and she learned the rhythm of the Duke of Wendover as another woman might have learned the hours of a husband. He worked late. He worked alone. He spoke aloud to no one and dictated only to himself, in a low, even voice, as if the act of saying a sentence proved to him that he had not yet lost the trick of speech. He read Latin half an hour at a stretch, and then English law for an hour, and then, once, a single page of what she thought might be poetry, because his voice softened on the last line, and then he laughed, very short, at himself. She heard him refuse a glass of wine offered by a footman. She heard him ask, twice in a week, for hot water and nothing else. She heard him receive Fenwick on a Thursday afternoon and answer the steward's long account of fence repairs with 3 words and a closed door, and she heard, after Fenwick had gone, the chair scrape back and the boots cross the carpet to the window and stand a long time at the glass without moving. She did not, in any of those hours, hear him weep. She came to know the silence of him as she had come to know the silence of his son. Theo asked, on the 2nd Sunday in April, whether his father was at home. "He is, Master Theodore. Why does he not come up?" She had been rolling a stocking. She set it down. She knelt by the chair and took the boy's ink-stained fingers in her own, and she did not lie, because she had given up the habit of lying to him on the day she had given him back his bloodied handkerchief washed and folded. "I think," she said, "your father is fighting a battle that needs fighting downstairs first. When it is finished, he will come up." "Will it be finished soon?" "I think it will be finished by midsummer." He considered that the way he considered a hard sum. "Good," he said. "I should like him to see the bird I drew." She kissed the top of his head, which she had never done before, and rose and rang for his broth, as if the kiss had been only the straightening of his hair. That night at the wall she heard the Duke read aloud, slowly, a list of names. They were the names of the tenants of the home farm. Beside each name he murmured a sum, and beside each sum, a second sum, and after the third name he set the pen down and said, "To no one, dear God." It was the only time she ever heard him say it. The next day she went down to Mrs. Aldous in the still room and asked, in the tone of a governess making conversation, what the rent of Bracken Cottage had been in her father's time. Mrs. Aldous, scraping wax, gave the figure without looking up. Grace thanked her. Grace climbed the stair. Grace wrote the figure on the inside of the cover of her catechism in pencil, so faint a thumb would smudge it, and beside it she wrote the figure she had heard through the wall, and the difference between them was the price of a girl's keep for a year. She closed the catechism. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to Theo. By the 3rd week of April she had a small page of such pairs, none of them written in any hand a stranger could read, and she carried it in her bodice against her stays. She did not know yet what she would do with it. She knew only that she had begun, in the quiet manner of a woman who has been told once too often that she has no part in the matter, to take a part. She met Fenwick on the stair on the morning of the 20th. He came up 2 steps at a time with the red ledger and stopped a step below her so that, for once, she stood the taller. Miss Pemberton, Mr. Fenwick, you burn a great deal of candle of a night. She felt the page against her ribs. She did not lower her eyes. Master Theodore reads late, sir. Master Theodore, said Fenwick, smiling without his mouth, should be asleep by 9. As, I think, should his governess. The household account will not bear extravagance. Then I shall buy my own candles, sir, from my own wage, when it is paid. The silver watch chain twitched on the moss-green velvet. The spectacles slipped a 1/4 inch and were not pushed back. You are very pert this morning, Miss Pemberton. I am very awake, Mr. Fenwick. He passed her without another word, and she went on up the stair with her knees not quite steady, and a small fierce gladness in her throat that she did not, at her age, recognize for what it was. She told no one. She did not tell the wall. But that night, when the Duke's voice came through the plaster dictating a 4th letter, she heard him pause halfway through a sentence and say, almost to himself, and the matter of the unpaid wages of the upper servants. Add that. I will not have a house in which the woman who keeps my son alive is asked to buy her own light. She set her forehead against the cold plaster and shut her eyes. He did not know her name. He did not know her face. He had not, in the 3 weeks since she had taken his coat from him on a stair, looked at her once. But he had known, somehow, in the small hours between his letters, that she existed, and that she was being starved of a shilling, and he had set it down on a list to be put right. She went back to the table. She took up the coat. She began, by candlelight, the last seam of the outer shoulder, the one that would hold the star invisible from the world. She worked until the bell for matins. She did not weep because she had not yet been given permission, by any voice inside her or outside, to weep over a coat or a man or a sum written in a catechism. She only sewed, very straight, very small, the stitches her grandmother had called the stitches of a woman who means what she does. And on the other side of the wall, in a library she had never entered, a man whose face she had seen once by lightning, sat at a desk with his sleeves turned back and wrote, in his own hand now, on a paper folded so small that it would travel in the lining of a coachman's hat, the first true sentence of the case he meant to bring: the thief is within the gate, and the gate is mine. He sealed it. He pressed the signet into the wax. He held the ring a moment in the lamplight and looked at the brass of his own arms as a man looks at a thing he has not earned in a long while and means, before the year is out, to earn again. Then he blew out the candle, and on her side of the wall, Grace Pemberton, who had been holding her breath without knowing it, let it out at last into the dark of the sewing room, and the two of them, by separate doors, went up to bed in the same house at the same hour for the first time in their lives. Neither of them slept. Downstairs, in the steward's room behind the green baize door, Silas Fenwick lit a second lamp, opened the red ledger to a page that bore 2 columns where there ought to have been one, and began, in his small slanting hand, to alter the figure of the Bracken Cottage rent for the month of April from £7 to 4, because a letter had arrived that morning from a Mr. Ezra Hollingsworth of Lincoln's Inn, proposing to come down into Devonshire to look at standing timber, and Silas Fenwick, who had not survived 3 masters by being slow, smelled an auditor in the wind. He smiled, this time, with his mouth. He dipped his pen. The house above him did not yet know that the war had moved, in the space of a single evening, out of the library and into the ledger, and that the next move belonged to a girl in a brown stuff gown, who carried a folded page against her stays and did not, herself, yet understand that she had already made it. The carriage came up the long drive at the wrong hour for visitors, and at precisely the right hour for a woman who had never in her life asked permission to arrive. It was a heavy traveling chariot, lacquered the color of dried blackberries, drawn by 4 grays whose breath made small clouds in the April air, and the crest on its panel was old enough that even Mrs. Aldous, who had stopped being impressed by crests in 1798, set down the silver she was counting and went to the window. Grace, in the green saloon, did not yet hear the wheels. She was sitting on a low stool beside Theo's daybed, which had been carried down for the morning because the sun was warm and the boy had begged for it, and she was reading aloud from a small calf-bound Cicero that had belonged to the late Duchess. The Latin came out of her mouth the way water comes out of a clean spring, without effort and without performance, each clause shaped and laid down before the next began. Theo, propped on 3 pillows and wrapped to the chin in the navy robe she had mended, was following the page with one ink-stained finger and translating under his breath, getting the cases right. Quusque tandem, she said. How long, then? He whispered. Abutere, Catalina, patientia nostra. Will you abuse, Catalina, our patience? He coughed, lightly, into the linen square she kept folded in his sleeve. She did not flinch. She did not pause. She turned the page. Outside, in the gravel court, a coachman was already letting down the steps. A footman in dark blue livery was opening the chariot door. From within emerged first a leather case, then a small black spaniel that was handed down with more ceremony than most infants, then a stout gloved hand, then the woman herself. Lady Honora Stanhope, Dowager Viscountess of Branscombe, set her violet kid boot on Wendover gravel for the first time in 11 years, took stock of the facade, noted the boarded window above the west wing and the moss at the base of the urns, and said audibly, "Well, it is worse than I was told, and I was told a great deal." She walked into her nephew's house without waiting to be announced, because she had not been announced anywhere since 1782, and did not intend to begin in Devonshire. Mrs. Aldous met her in the hall, and curtsied to exactly the depth that 60 years of service had taught her was correct, for a dowager viscountess of moderate fortune and immoderate temper. "Your ladyship, where is my nephew?" "His grace is in the estate room, my lady, with his thief, yes, I know. I am not here for his thief. Where is the child?" "The young master is in the green saloon, my lady, with his governess." "Yes, take me there, and do not announce me. I should like to see what manner of woman has been left in charge of the only Harcourt under 12. Mrs. Aldous, who had not smiled in public since the late Duchess's funeral, allowed the corner of her mouth to move by perhaps the width of a hair. "This way, my lady." The double doors of the green saloon were a little ajar. Grace had reached the 7th paragraph and her voice had dropped into the low register Cicero asked for at that point, the one that turned accusation into something almost tender, almost grieved. Theo had stopped translating aloud. He was simply listening, his cheek against the pillow, his eyes half closed, the way a child listens to music he has loved a long time without knowing why. Lady Honora stood in the doorway for a full minute and did not interrupt. When Grace closed the book, the dowager said, from behind her, "Continue." Grace rose at once. The Cicero went onto the low table without a sound. She turned, found a woman the size and authority of a small church, and dropped a curtsy so clean and so unhurried that Lady Honora's gray-green eyes narrowed half an inch in approval. "I did not mean stand up, child. I meant continue reading." "Where did you learn that Latin?" "From my father, my lady." "Who was?" "A schoolmaster, my lady. In Hampshire. He took pupils for the universities. And he taught his daughter Cicero. He taught his daughter what he taught his pupils, my lady. He saw no reason for the lesson to change in the next room." Lady Honora examined her for a long moment, from the brooch of yellowed ivory at her throat, to the patched hem of her stuff gown, to the small, steady hands folded one over the other. Then she walked past her, sat on the daybed beside Theo without asking, took the boy's cold fingers between her own warm gloved ones, and said, "Theodore, you are thinner than your last letter promised." "I am sorry, great aunt." "Do not be sorry. Be improved. Who reads to you?" "Miss Pemberton, ma'am. Every day, ma'am. And in the evening also." "And does she read you the books your father chooses, or the books you choose?" Theo's eyes moved, just once, to Grace. "Both, ma'am, but she lets me choose the order." Lady Honora made a small sound at the back of her throat that was neither approval nor disapproval, and was therefore both. She rose. She turned to Grace. You will walk with me in the long gallery in 1 hour. Tell my nephew, when he can be pried from his ledger, that his aunt has arrived and intends to stay until she has done what she came to do." She paused at the door. Without turning, she added, "Continue the Cicero." The boy was settling. She swept out. Grace stood very still in the middle of the green saloon for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she sat down again on the stool, opened the small calf-bound book to the page she had marked with her thumb, and read on, because Theo was watching her to see whether the great lady's arrival had frightened her, and she did not intend to be frightened where the boy could see. In the estate room, 2 corridors away, Caspar Harcourt set down the letter he had been writing for the 3rd time that morning when the door opened without a knock. He looked up, saw who it was, and rose. He did not smile. He had not smiled in his aunt's presence since he was 9 years old, and she had never required it. "Aunt, Caspar, sit down. I have ridden from Bath in 2 days, and I have not come for pleasantries. Send for tea, strong, and send that man Fenwick out of the house for the afternoon, on any pretext you can invent. I will not speak under his roof while he is in it." "He is not master here, Aunt. He believes himself to be. That is the same thing in practice, and you know it, or you would not have written to an auditor in such guarded language a fortnight ago." "Yes, I know about the auditor. Marlowe wrote to me." "Sit down," I said. He sat. The gray eyes that had unnerved magistrates and bankers and one foreign ambassador rested on his aunt's face with the wariness of a man who has been outmaneuvered from this chair before. She removed her gloves finger by finger, set them on the desk, and folded her hands on top of them. "Caspar, what are you being told about yourself in London?" "I do not go to London. That is not what I asked." He was silent. "I will tell you then, since you appear not to know. In 3 drawing rooms last week, and at 1 whist table, and twice at the opera in the interval, I heard from women I have known 40 years that the Duke of Wendover has gone the way of his father, that he speaks to no one, sees no one, signs no papers but with a shaking hand, that his only son is dying of consumption and will not see Christmas, that the estate is being held together by the heroic and selfless labor of a Mr. Fenwick, who is, the story runs, the last decent man left in Devonshire, and who weeps openly at the condition of his master." A muscle moved once in Caspar's jaw. Otherwise he did not move. "I heard further," she went on, "that there is a kind, well-bred widow named Lady Beatrice Carow, who has been most attentive to the household in its hour of need, and who, when the inevitable happens, would make a sensible second duchess and a kind stepmother to the heir, should the heir survive, which God forbid he should not, which God almost certainly will not, because the cough, my dears, the cough." She let the silence sit. "Aunt, I am not finished. The shaking hand. Caspar, the shaking hand is the one I came to see. Hold up your right hand." He held it up. It was perfectly steady. "I thought so." She nodded once, sharply. "Now hold up the other." He held up the left. And it was also steady, though there was a faint white scar across the back of it. Recent, the kind a man gets when a pistol ball passes near enough to graze the knuckle on its way to a shoulder. Her eyes went to it. They did not comment. "Caspar, your father died mad. Everyone in this county knows it, and half of England does. That is a fact, and we do not pretend otherwise in this family. What is also a fact is that you are not him, and the man who is telling London that you are him is telling them so for a reason. Reasons of that kind end in one of 2 ways. Either the man telling the story becomes very rich and the man being talked about becomes very dead, or the reverse. There is no third ending, you understand me. I understand you, the child. Is he dying?" The question was put so directly that for a moment he could not answer. He looked, briefly, at the corner of the desk, where a small drawing in Theo's hand sat under a paperweight, a sketch of a horse with too many legs. "His lungs are weak," he said. "He coughs blood. Not every day. He has gained 4 ounces since February. 4 ounces. 4 ounces, Aunt. Miss Pemberton weighs him on the kitchen scale on Sundays and writes it in a book. He had lost 2 pounds between Michaelmas and February. He has gained 4 ounces in 8 weeks. It is not nothing." Lady Honora's gloved hand, which had been resting on her gloves, lifted and went to her own throat for a moment, and then returned. "Miss Pemberton, his governess, the girl reading Cicero in your green saloon, yes. Caspar, look at me. How long has she been in this house?" 8 months. "Who engaged her?" "Mrs. Aldous, through the vicar. Not Fenwick, not Fenwick. Fenwick has tried twice to dismiss her. Mrs. Aldous declined to find the paperwork." Good woman, Mrs. Aldous. She breathed out, slowly, through her nose. Caspar, I am going to say something to you that you will not like. The story in London is not only that you are mad. The story in London is that your son will die before the year is out, and that when he does, the dukedom will pass, by a settlement your grandfather was foolish enough to write, to a cousin in Yorkshire who has not been sober since the Regency began and who owes Mr. Fenwick, I am told, rather a great deal of money. Does that settlement still stand? It still stands. Then the war, my dear, is not over your ledgers. The ledgers are the skirmish. The war is over the child, and the child is being kept alive in your house, against the prediction of every physician your administrator has paid to attend him, by a 23-year-old schoolmaster's daughter, in a brown stuff gown, who reads him Cicero in the original and weighs him on Sundays. Do you understand now why I have come? He understood. He sat very still, and he understood, and the understanding moved through him the way cold water moves through a man who has been standing too long in the sun without knowing he was thirsty. I had not, he said at last, and his voice was lower than it had been, put those two facts together in that order. No, you had been told they were separate facts. That is how it is done. A man like Fenwick does not lie to you, Caspar. He arranges the truths so that you arrange them wrongly yourself. The auditor will find the money. The money is the easy part. The hard part is the boy. And the boy is being kept by the girl. And the girl has no protector in this house but Mrs. Aldous and an old book of Cicero. And Fenwick knows it. He will move against her first. He will move against her before the auditor's coach is on the Bath Road. Do you hear me? I hear you. Then do not be a fool. Do not wait to be gallant at the correct dramatic moment. Be vulgar. Be quick. He rose. He walked to the window. He stood for a long time with his back to her, looking out at the gravel court where the violet chariot was being walked round to the stables. When he turned, the gray eyes were no longer cold in the way they had been at breakfast. They were cold in another way entirely, a way that had a use. Aunt, will you stay until midsummer? I will stay until it is done. Then stay in the rose suite. It has been aired, and come to dinner tonight. Fenwick will be there. I should like him to meet you across a table. I should like that also. She allowed herself for the first time the smallest of smiles. Send the girl up to me at 4. I told her the long gallery in an hour. Make it 3. I want her tired before I begin. You will not frighten her. My dear, if she has lasted 8 months in this house with that man at the dinner table and that child on her conscience, she does not frighten. I want to see what she does when she is told the truth. That is a different thing. He inclined his head. She rose, gathered her gloves, and went out. He stood for a moment in the empty estate room. Then he sat down, drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him, dipped his pen, and wrote, in a hand that did not shake at all, a second letter, this one to the magistrate at Exeter, asking whether it was true that one Silas Fenwick had been seen in the company of certain persons known to the bench in connection with the highway shooting of an unnamed gentleman 3 nights before Lady Day. He folded it, sealed it with the Harcourt signet, and rang for a man he trusted to ride to Exeter without stopping at any inn between. Upstairs, in the long gallery, Lady Honora walked the length of the room twice while she waited, looking at the portraits. She stopped before the small one of the late Duchess at 20, in a jonquil yellow gown, and stood there a long time. When Grace came in at 3, her hands clean of ink and her cap freshly pinned, the dowager did not turn from the portrait. She said, without preamble, "Sit down on that bench, Miss Pemberton, and tell me how much blood the child coughed up this week." Grace sat. She folded her hands. She said, "A teaspoon on Monday. None since." "Good. Now tell me what Mr. Fenwick said to you in the corridor, on the 17th of March, when he believed no one was listening." Grace's eyes lifted. They did not widen. They simply found the dowager's face and stayed there. "He said that a girl of my station should be careful what bundles she carried at night through a gentleman's house, my lady, and that there were 2 kinds of women who left great houses, and only one of them with a character." "And you answered?" "I answered that I carried only what I was bid to carry, my lady, and that I would carry it in daylight if his lordship preferred. And his lordship slapped the wall beside my head with his ledger, my lady, and walked on." Lady Honora turned, then from the portrait. She looked at the young woman on the bench in the brown stuff gown with the ivory brooch at her throat, and the gray-green eyes went over her once, slowly, from cap to boot, the way an old horsewoman looks at a young mare she has just decided to buy. "Miss Pemberton, she said. "You will dine with us tonight. At the long table beside me, you will wear what you have. You will say nothing unless I address you. And when I address you, you will answer in the voice you used for Cicero this morning, and not one note higher. Do you understand me? My lady, I am the governess. I cannot, you can, because I have said so, and because tonight Mr. Fenwick will sit down to dinner expecting one war and will be served another, and I require a witness at my elbow who has already been bruised by his ledger and who will not flinch when I cut him. Will you flinch?" Grace looked at the old woman for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "No, my lady." "Good." Lady Honora turned back to the portrait of the young Duchess in her yellow gown. "Then go and tell Mrs. Aldous to set a fourth place. And send up my spaniel. He travels badly and requires consolation." Grace rose, curtsied, and went out. In the corridor she did not run. She walked, at the pace a governess walks, past 3 closed doors and 1 open one, and only when she reached the back stair did she put her hand flat against the paneling for a single steadying breath. Because the war had moved again, in the space of one April afternoon, out of the ledger and onto the dinner table, and the next move now belonged to a man in spectacles who did not yet know that the dowager had arrived. The card arrived on a Tuesday, pressed into Mrs. Aldous's hand by a footman in livery she did not recognize, and by Wednesday morning the whole servants' hall knew that Lady Beatrice Caro would dine at Wendover Court on the Friday following. Fenwick had arranged it. Fenwick announced it. He stood in the housekeeper's parlor with his red ledger tucked beneath his arm and his spectacles low on his nose, and he read the menu aloud, as though he were reading a contract. Turbot and lobster sauce, a saddle of mutton, 3 removes, 2 creams, a pineapple from the Succession House at Branscombe. Mrs. Aldous wrote nothing down. She listened with her hands folded over her chatelaine and her mouth set, and when he had finished, she said only, "His Grace has approved this." "His Grace has been informed," Fenwick said. He smiled at her with the lower half of his face only. By Thursday evening, the green dining room had been opened for the first time in 9 months. Holland sheets came off the chairs in slow billows of dust. The long mahogany was rubbed with beeswax until it took the candle, and the silver, locked these many seasons in the butler's pantry, was carried up in lined baskets to be counted twice and laid out with a draper's precision. Grace watched 2 girls polishing forks at the long deal table in the still room, their elbows working in time, and she did not speak. She had been given no part in the preparations. She had not been told she would be wanted. She was told on the Friday, at 4:30, by Fenwick himself. He found her on the back stair with a basket of mended linen on her hip. He did not stand aside to let her pass. He stood 1 step above her, which made him taller than he was, and he looked down through the spectacles and said, "His Grace requests the presence of Master Theodore's governess in the green drawing-room before dinner. 8 o'clock. You will come down with the boy and be presented to Lady Beatrice. Wear something clean." Grace adjusted the basket on her hip. "His Grace requests it," she repeated, evenly. "Or you do." "It is the same thing," Fenwick said. It was not. She knew it was not. But the basket was heavy, and the girl behind her on the stair was waiting, and so Grace inclined her head the half-inch propriety required, and went up to the schoolroom and set the basket down, and stood for a long moment with her hand on the lid, looking at nothing. Theo was reading on the window seat. He had a color in his cheek that she did not trust. He looked up at her over the top of the Cicero and said, "Are you cross?" "No," she said. "You look cross." "I am thinking," she said, and crossed to the press and took down the second of her 2 gowns, the one she did not wear in the day, which was the same string color as the other, but had not been turned at the cuffs, and laid it flat on the bed. At 8 o'clock she went down. She had brushed her hair until it shone dark against the candle, and she had pinned it low in the same modest coil, and she had fixed her mother's ivory brooch at her throat, where the linen collar closed. She had put no scent on. She had put no ribbon in. She held Theo by the hand because he asked to be held, and she felt the small, dry heat of his palm and counted the steps down with him so that he would not cough on the landing. The green drawing-room had been lit with more candles than it had seen in a decade. The fire was high. The Duke stood at the chimney-piece with one hand on the marble, in his black evening coat and a fresh cravat tied close, and at the center of the carpet, in pale rose silk with seed pearls at her throat, stood Lady Beatrice Caro. She was beautiful. Grace had not expected that. Lady Beatrice was 24, tall, very fair, with the long throat the miniatures favored, and a small composed mouth. And she turned at the door and looked at Grace, as one looks at a piece of furniture one is considering having removed. "Ah," said Fenwick, from his place by the second window, "the governess." And the air, Theo's hand tightened in hers. The Duke did not speak. He looked once at Grace, very briefly, and then away into the fire, and Grace felt the small, cold thing slip into her chest that she had been holding back since 4 o'clock, because she understood, in that look, that he had not been told either. He had been managed, he had been moved into this room with the same patience with which Fenwick moved figures down a column. "Master Theodore," Lady Beatrice said in a kind voice, and bent the necessary 3 inches to be at the boy's eye. "I have heard a great deal about you. My cousin Frederick was at Westminster with your father. He had the same eyes." "Thank you," Theo said. It was correctly said. Grace had taught him to say it. They went in to dinner. Grace was placed, by some arrangement of Fenwick's, 3 chairs down from the Duke, between the vicar Mr. Marlowe, who had been bidden at the last hour to make up the table, and a thin, red-faced squire from over the moor who spoke chiefly to his soup. Lady Beatrice sat at Caspar's right. Fenwick sat at his left. The candles were tall and the room very warm, and the conversation moved at the slow pace such conversations move, of carriage horses and a bishop in town, and the deplorable state of the turnpike, and Grace ate what was set before her, and answered Mr. Marlowe's kind small questions about the boy's Latin, in a low voice, and did not look up. She did not look up until the second remove, when Fenwick set down his glass with a small, clean sound and said, into a lull, "Your Grace, I must beg a moment of household business." The Duke turned his head an inch. "At table, Mr. Fenwick?" "It concerns the table, Your Grace, or rather, what has lately been leaving it." Fenwick's spectacles caught the candle. "Lady Beatrice will forgive a country matter. We have, these several weeks, been missing certain articles. Linen, chiefly. A silver salt, a pair of candle snuffers from the East Passage. Mrs. Aldous has kept a tally. I had not meant to trouble your Grace until the sum was greater. But there is a circumstance." The Duke set down his knife. "Speak it," he said. "It has been observed," Fenwick said, with the gentleness of a man laying a cloth over a corpse, "that Miss Pemberton has been seen, on more than one occasion, descending the back stair after the household has retired, carrying a bundle. The night porter has noted it. Mrs. Aldous's under-housemaid has noted it. I would not, of course, advance an accusation. I would only beg your Grace's leave to have the bundle inspected, the next time it should pass." The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when a knife is set down by every hand at once. Grace did not move. She felt the heat climb her throat and stop at the brooch and could not climb further. The vicar beside her drew in a small breath. Lady Beatrice lifted her glass and looked at Grace over the rim with a polite, regretful curiosity, as though she were watching a small dog being put down humanely. Caspar turned his head. He looked at Grace. She met his eye, because she had been raised to meet eyes when she was accused, and she saw in his face the thing she had been afraid to see, which was not anger and not disbelief, but a slow, steady tightening, as a man tightens at a wound he has been struck in the dark. He knew. She saw him know. She saw him understand, in the half-second the candle gave him, exactly what bundle had been carried down the back stair these many weeks, and exactly whose blood was on it. He opened his mouth. He did not speak quickly enough. "Mr. Fenwick," Lady Beatrice said, smoothly, into the half-second, "you are too delicate. If a thing is to be said, it must be said. Miss Pemberton, do you carry a bundle down the servants' stair at night?" Grace set her hands flat on either side of her plate. The linen was very white. She felt the wood of the table through it. "I do, my lady," she said. "And what is in the bundle?" "At mending," Grace said. "At midnight?" "At whatever hour I am free of the schoolroom." "For whom?" The question came down the table with the cleanness of a blade laid across a board. Grace felt the Duke's stillness at the end of it. She felt the vicar beside her not breathing. She felt Fenwick's spectacles, and she felt, very plainly, the shape of the answer she could not give, because to name the coat was to name the night, and to name the night was to name a man who had come up the back stair bleeding from a wound he had asked her to keep silent. "For the household," she said. It was true. It was also nothing. "Ah," said Lady Beatrice, and smiled, and looked at Caspar with a small, graceful turn of the head, as one defers a verdict to the only judge present. Caspar said, "Miss Pemberton has my full confidence." He said it. He said it clearly, But he said it 3 seconds after the room had decided, and 3 seconds in a green dining room at the second remove is the difference between defense and apology. And every person at the table heard the gap, including Grace. Fenwick inclined his head. Of course, Your Grace. I have advanced nothing. I have only mentioned a circumstance. The bundle, no doubt, will continue to pass, and no doubt Mrs. Aldous' tally will continue to lengthen, and we shall speak of it in the proper place. The mutton came in. Grace ate 3 mouthfuls. She did not know what they were. She answered Mr. Marlowe when he asked her, very kindly, whether the boy enjoyed his Virgil, and she said yes, very much, and she smiled at him, because he was trying to give her the cover of an ordinary conversation, and she felt grateful to him, in a way that hurt more than the accusation had. Lady Beatrice spoke of an opera. The squire spoke of a mare. The Duke ate almost nothing, and twice Grace felt him look down the table at her, and twice she did not lift her eyes, because if she lifted her eyes she would not be able to keep her face, and there was Theo to be considered, who was not in the room but whose name would be in the room by morning if she wept at this table. She waited until the ladies withdrew. She walked behind Lady Beatrice through the double doors into the long drawing room. She poured the coffee with steady hands. She answered, when asked, that she had been at Wendover 3 years. She said, when asked, that her father had been a clergyman in Wiltshire. She said, when Lady Beatrice observed that it was a great pity such accomplishments should be wasted on a sickly child in a closed house, that Master Theodore was a remarkable pupil, and the house would not always be closed. Then she said, if your ladyship will excuse me, the boy will not sleep without his lesson read. Lady Beatrice excused her with the smallest possible movement of one gloved hand. Grace climbed the great stair at the pace a governess climbs. She climbed the back stair, after, at the pace a governess does not. She did not stop at the schoolroom. Theo was already asleep. She had heard Mrs. Aldous on the landing an hour ago. She went past the schoolroom door and past the linen room and into the small sewing closet at the end of the passage where the single tallow candle stood, and she closed the door behind her, and she turned the key in the lock, and she stood with her back against the wood for the length of a breath she could not quite take. Then she crossed to the chair. The coat was laid across the back of it. She had set it there that morning, in the grey hour before the house woke, because the light from the high window was best then for the last of the work. The ruined shoulder was nearly mended. She had matched the wool by candle and by patience, thread by thread, and the bullet hole was closed under a square of broadcloth so fine that one would have to know it was there to find it, and the lining was sound, and the sleeve hung true. There remained the inner seam at the collar, where the blood had stiffened the wool through, and one button at the cuff that had hung by a single thread. 2 hours of work, perhaps 3. She lifted it down. She sat in the chair. She spread the coat across her lap as she had 100 times now, and she laid her open hand flat over the dark patch on the shoulder where the stain would not quite come out, and she looked at it for a long time in the small, unsteady light. She had not cried at the table. She had not cried on the stair. She had not cried when Fenwick spoke, or when the Duke spoke late, or when Lady Beatrice smiled. She cried now. She cried with her face bent low over the wool, so that the candle would not see, and her shoulders did not shake, because she had been taught as a child not to shake, and the tears went down silently into the broadcloth where the blood had been, and she did not wipe them away, because her hands were on the coat. She cried not for the dinner, she cried not for the bundle, nor for the bishop's daughter at her ease in pale rose silk, nor for the slow tightening she had seen in Caspar's face when he understood and could not speak. She cried because in the morning Mrs. Aldous would come, gently, and ask her to pack her box. She cried because she would be turned out of this house before sunset, and the coat across her lap would not be finished. The inner seam at the collar would not be closed. The button at the cuff would hang by its single thread until some other woman, somewhere, cut it off and threw it out. She had carried it down the back stair in a bundle 37 times, she had counted. She would not carry it down a 38th. She drew the needle from the small pin cushion at her wrist. She threaded it by the candle, on the second try, her hands not quite obeying. She bent over the collar and set the first stitch of the inner seam, very small, very even, the way her mother had taught her over a parsonage table in Wiltshire when she was 9 years old. And she set the second, and the third. The tears went on going down. She did not stop them. She did not stop the stitches either. If she had until sunrise, she would have until sunrise, and she would put into this coat every hour she had left in this house. because it was the only answer she had to a green dining room and a smiling woman in rose silk and a man at the head of the table who had been 3 seconds too late. She did not hear the floorboard in the corridor outside. She did not see the line of candlelight that paused on the other side of the paneling, at the height of a tall man's eye, where in the daylight one could find, if one knew to look, a narrow vertical crack in the wall between the sewing closet and the library beyond. The candle on the other side of the wall did not move for a long while. Caspar Harcourt, Duke of Wendover, stood in the narrow service corridor, with one hand braced against the paneling and the other holding a brass chamber stick that had begun to tremble. He had come down by the back stair on a different errand, a letter for the night groom, and had paused only because a thread of lamplight bled through the seam in the wood at the height of his shoulder. He had meant to glance and pass on. He did not pass on. Through the slit in the paneling he saw the sewing closet as if framed in a miniature. Grace Pemberton knelt on the bare boards, her hair loosened from its coil, the black wool of his old riding coat spread across her lap like a fallen banner. Her finger rested on the dark island of stain at the shoulder, the one she had not been able to lift. Her shoulders did not heave. She wept the way servants weep, in a private economy, mouth pressed shut, the breath coming through the nose in small, even draws. It took him 3 seconds. In the first, he saw the coat and remembered the rain, the powder smell, the ditch beyond the home wood, the lead ball that had plowed his shoulder, and the unknown girl on the back stair who had taken the ruined thing from him without a word. In the second, he saw the careful, almost prayerful neatness of her mending, the new lining cut from her own petticoat hem, the buttons resewn with double thread. In the third, he understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has read a column of figures and seen the lie, that the trouble at the formal supper had not been about silver or linen. It had been about her, about this, about a woman who had carried his secret in her hands for 3 months while his cousin's hired man counted the silver in another room and called her thief. He pressed his forehead to the panel. The wood was cool. He did not knock. He did not open the door that he could have opened, being master of the house and the wall both. He lifted his right hand and laid the broad palm flat against the boards at exactly the height of her shoulder on the other side, as a man lays his hand on the flank of a horse he has nearly killed. He held it there until the cramp came into his fingers. Grace, kneeling, did not feel the wall warm. She heard nothing. She finished the small task of folding the coat into its careful square, blew out the candle, and went up to bed in the dark. Caspar did not go up. He went, instead, the long way round to the library, the chamber stick guttering, and sat down at his father's desk and uncapped the inkwell with a hand that no longer trembled. He wrote 2 letters. The first was to Mr. Josiah Penrose, auditor, of Lincoln's Inn, requesting his immediate presence at Wendover with full authority to open every ledger in the estate office, including those kept in the locked press. The second was to Sir Rowland Massingham, magistrate of the Western District, asking him to attend in person, with constables, on a date to be named, on a matter of fraud and, perhaps, of attempted murder. He sealed both with the Harcourt signet and rang for the night groom himself. By dawn, the letters were riding north. 3 weeks passed in a quiet that the household mistook for calm. Mrs. Aldous noted only that the master rose earlier and that the door of the estate office stayed unlocked for the first time in 11 years. Fenwick noted that a thin grey gentleman with a leather case had arrived from London and been given the small green chamber, but Fenwick, who had learned to read the master's silences, mistook this silence for distraction. He doubled the entries in his second ledger and slept well. Grace noted that Theo's cough loosened. The boy had been moved, on the Duke's order, from the sealed east wing into the south rooms where the sun lay until afternoon, and a bath physician had come and gone and left behind small pots of beef tea and a regimen. Grace read to him each morning, Cicero in the mornings because the Latin steadied his breathing, and in the afternoons she sat on the window seat with the boy's head against her shoulder and watched the rooks turn over the home wood. She did not see the Duke. He kept to the library or rode out at first light. Once, passing on the stair, he had bowed to her, a slight, exact bow such as a gentleman gives a lady met in a foreign city, and gone on. She had returned the curtsy and felt the blood rise in her throat and had not understood it. The midsummer ball came on a Thursday. The west wing, sealed since the late Duchess's death, had been opened in a hurry of beeswax and lemon oil. The chandeliers had come down from their canvas shrouds and gone up again on fresh chains, 300 candles in each, and the long gallery had been polished until the parquet showed back the gilt of the cornice. Lady Honora had taken command of the invitations and had written, with a small grim smile, to every house within 40 miles whose mistress had repeated, in the spring, the rumor that the Duke of Wendover was mad and his heir already buried. They all came. They came in barouches and traveling chariots, the Caro carriage among the first, Lady Beatrice in white satin with a wreath of myrtle in her hair, her father the Earl beside her in his garter ribbon. Sir Rowland Massingham came in a plain black coach with 2 men who did not go up to the ballroom but waited in the steward's parlor with their hats on their knees. Mr. Penrose, the auditor, came on foot from the village inn carrying his leather case, and was shown by Mrs. Aldous, on the Duke's standing order, directly into the estate office, where he sat down at Fenwick's own desk and opened the red-bound ledger. Fenwick saw him through the half-open door as he crossed the hall in his new green coat. The administrator did not stop. He had spent the afternoon arranging the placement of dowagers and had a card in his hand. He smiled, the long, thin smile of a man who has been useful, and went on toward the music. Upstairs, in a room she did not know, Grace stood very still, while Mrs. Aldous tied the last ribbon at the small of her back. The dress was the color of jonquils. It had arrived in a long box from London on the Duke's account, with a card in his own hand that said only, "From the master of the house to its mistress of mendings. Wear it tonight." Grace had read the card 3 times and put it in the drawer with her mother's ivory brooch and had spoken of it to no one. Mrs. Aldous, who had received her own instructions, dressed her with the economy of a woman who had once dressed a duchess, and at the end she stepped back and looked, and her bony face softened by an increment that Grace had never seen there. "You will do," said Mrs. Aldous. The gown was taffeta, a yellow so pale and warm it seemed to hold the late light of the long evening. Ivory satin ribbons crossed beneath the bodice. Her hair was bound up with a tortoiseshell comb she had not known the house possessed. Long gloves of kid the color of cream ran past her elbows. At her throat, in place of any borrowed jewel, she had pinned her mother's plain ivory brooch. "He said the gallery, miss, at the foot of the great stair, when the first dance is called." Grace went down alone. She came into the gallery as the orchestra was tuning. The room hushed by a small degree, and then resumed. She saw faces turn and turn away with the practiced speed of people who do not yet know whether a stranger is to be acknowledged. She did not look for the Duke. She looked, by old instinct, for the small figure that should not have been there, and found him. Theo, in a clean nightshirt and his blue wool robe, sitting in the corner of the half-landing above with his thin legs through the balusters and his chin on the rail, smuggled down by Mrs. Aldous against every doctor's order. He saw her and his whole face opened. She lifted one gloved hand to him, very small, and he lifted his back. Then the music stopped altogether. Sir Rowland Massingham had come into the gallery from the steward's door, and behind him, between his 2 constables, walked Mr. Penrose with the red-bound ledger open in his hands, and a second, smaller book of black leather laid on top of it. Behind them, by the elbow, came Silas Fenwick, still in his green coat, his spectacles a little askew. He was not yet in irons. He was being walked. Lady Honora rose from her seat in the center of the room. The pluma of her turban trembled once and was still. The Duke of Wendover came out of the library door at the far end of the gallery, dressed in black with a white cravat tied in a plain knot, and crossed the polished floor without hurry until he stood beside the magistrate. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," Sir Rowland's voice was the voice he used in quarter sessions. "I beg your indulgence for a quarter of an hour. A matter of the king's business has overtaken the evening's pleasure, and his grace has asked that it be done before his guests rather than behind a closed door, so that no man may say afterwards it was done in shadow." He opened the smaller black book. "These are the private accounts of Mr. Silas Fenwick, administrator of the Wendover estate, these 11 years past. They have been compared this afternoon in the estate office with the ledgers kept openly in his grace's name. Mr. Penrose." The auditor cleared his throat, a dry small sound, and began to read. He did not read long. He read a column of figures from the open book, then the matching column from the red ledger, then the difference between them. He read it 5 times, for 5 years, and the gallery, which had begun the recitation with the polite blankness of people listening to mathematics, had by the 3rd year fallen into the stillness of people listening to a sentence being passed. £11,000 in 5 years, wages withheld from servants and entered as paid. Tenants' rents collected twice. The Duke's own household allowance routed, by a thin and clever channel, into a bank at Bristol under another man's name. And one entry, said Mr. Penrose, lifting his head, "of £300, paid in cash, to a man called Haller, on the 2nd day of March last, with no service named against it. Haller, my lords, was taken at Plymouth a fortnight ago in another matter, and has confessed, before 2 witnesses, that he was hired in a tavern at Exeter to lie in the home wood at Wendover and put a ball through whoever rode out of the south gate at dusk on the 3rd of March. A woman somewhere in the gallery made a small sound and put her hand to her mouth. The Duke did not look at Fenwick. He looked, briefly, at Lady Beatrice Carow, who had gone the color of her own satin, and then past her, at her father, whose face had not moved. The Earl of Carow gathered his daughter's elbow without a word and walked her, gently, the length of the gallery and out of the door. They did not come back. 3 other carriages were called for in the next 10 minutes and were not refused. Sir Rowland nodded to his men. The constables closed on Fenwick from either side, and one of them, almost kindly, took the green coat by the elbow. The administrator's spectacles slid the last inch down his nose. He opened his mouth once, as if to begin a sentence he had prepared over several years, and closed it again. They walked him out by the same door he had come in. The music did not resume. The Duke turned, at last, and looked down the long room. Grace stood where she had stood, beside the foot of the great stair, the yellow of her gown the only warm color in the gallery. He crossed to her. He did not hurry. The guests parted for him as water parts for a hull, and Lady Honora in the center lifted her leque and held it open before her face like a small black shield, behind which she was, perhaps, smiling. He stopped 2 paces from Grace and bowed. In his hands he carried a folded square of black wool. He unfolded it with the care of a man unfolding a flag, and the gallery saw that it was a riding coat, plain, exact, the shoulder mended so finely that the eye had to be told where the wound had been. He laid it across his own forearm and held it out to her. "This garment," he said, and his voice carried without effort the length of the room, "belongs to the woman who saved it, as do I." He did not kneel. He did not need to. Grace took the coat. Her gloved hands closed on the wool, and she felt, through the kid, the small ridge of her own stitching at the shoulder. She did not speak. She was not, in that moment, capable of it. She inclined her head, the small, precise inclination of a governess greeting a master, and then, because she was no longer a governess, she lifted her face and looked him in the eye. "Miss Pemberton," said the Duke of Wendover, "the first dance is mine." Behind him, the leader of the orchestra, who had been waiting on a glance from Lady Honora, lifted his bow. The opening bars of a waltz, still scandalous in country houses and forbidden in better ones, moved out across the parquet. The Duke held out his hand. Grace, after the smallest pause, in which she folded the black coat once and laid it across the banister behind her, set her gloved fingers in his. They moved into the center of the gallery. He did not dance well. He danced like a man who had learned the steps at 16 and not used them since. She did not dance well either. They moved nevertheless, and on the 3rd turn she felt his hand settle at the small of her back as if it had found the place it had been looking for, and she lifted her eyes to his and found him already looking down at her with an expression she had last seen, in profile and from very close, when he had stood on the other side of a wall and pressed his palm to the boards at the height of her shoulder. Above them, on the half-landing, Theo Harcourt put both his thin hands through the balusters and clapped. He clapped alone for 1 beat, and then Lady Honora began to clap, and then Mrs. Aldous from the doorway, and then the gallery, slowly and then together, and the sound rose and held under the chandeliers like a second music laid over the first. The Duke bent his head until his mouth was beside her ear. "You opened a window," he said, "the first night I knew of you. Against the rules of this house, I have spent the spring opening every door behind you." Grace closed her eyes for the space of 1 turn. "My lord," she said, against his shoulder, "you may yet have to open one more." "Name it." "The east wing. Theo asks for it. He says the rooks are there." "It is opened," he said. "It was opened on Tuesday." They turned again. She did not weep. The yellow taffeta moved about her ankles like the inside of a lit lantern. Across the room, by the long window that gave on the south lawn, Lady Honora lowered her leque at last and allowed herself, in the privacy of her own face, the smile she had been saving since March. Long after midnight, when the carriages had gone and the candles had been pinched and Theo had been carried up asleep, Grace stood alone at the foot of the great stair with the black coat folded once more across her arm. The Duke came down the corridor toward her, in his shirt sleeves, the cravat untied. He stopped on the lowest step. "It is yours," he said, "of the coat. Keep it." "It was always yours. It was always ours." She looked up at him. The hall was nearly dark. A single branch of candles burned on the side table. In its light she saw, on the inside of his cuff, a small dark fleck that might have been ink and might have been the older stain that no amount of water had ever quite lifted from the wool in her hands. "Why me?" she said. The question came out smaller than she had meant. He thought for a moment. "Because you were the only one in this house," he said, "who ever truly saw me. And because I, through a crack in a wall, was at last permitted to see you." He went up the stair. She stood a long while at the bottom, with the coat across her arm. Above her, in the dark, a window in the east wing stood open to the June night, and the cool air moved down the corridors of the great closed house and into every room that had been shut, and a girl in a yellow gown, who had once been told she might not unlatch a single sash, now heard, faintly, the rooks beginning to stir in the home wood before dawn. She had mended a coat. She had opened a window. She had, at the last, been seen. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever, like Grace, mended in silence what someone else broke, asking nothing in return? Is there a wall in your own life with a crack in it, through which someone has been watching you and finally seeing who you truly are? And when the Duke crossed the ballroom in front of all of London to claim the woman in the jonquil gown, did you feel that some forms of justice are slow, but they do arrive? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.